Cool. And if you've got questions throughout, please just pop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them afterwards. So welcome everybody to today's webinar, all about optimizing contract management through identifying what your core activities are and playbooks. So just to introduce myself, my name's Roisin. I'm the COO here at the Law Boutique. And for those of you who don't know, the Law Boutique is a legal optimization company, which means that we really optimize the way in which in-house legal functions work. And whether that be through sort of introducing targeted tech or providing outsourcing services or legal design, legal optimization is really all about making your in-house legal team as efficient and lean and scalable as possible to really drive business growth. So we typically work with tech scale-up companies and also larger organizations. So we have really significant experience of the types of challenges faced by these sorts of organizations when it comes to contract management. And presumably that's why you've all joined today, to find out sort of some tips and tricks to deal with your contract management. Okay, so in today's session, we'll first of all be kicking off by talking about the problem posed by contract management for in-house teams. Then we'll be looking at strategy when it comes to dealing with your contracts. We'll then be looking at the core versus non-core distinction, insourcing and outsourcing, and finally we'll be talking about playbooks. Okay, so what is the problem faced by in-house teams when it comes to contract management? So the problem with managing all of your contracts in-house is that reviewing and negotiating routine commercial contracts can take up most of legal's time. So in a recent survey carried out by Juro last year, they found that 63% of in-house legal's time is spent reviewing and managing commercial contracts, which is obviously a huge amount of time. But the problem is that those contracts simply aren't business critical to send to external counsel to review, because it's just too expensive to do that. So as a result, either A, the contract takes up precious legal resource to review, or alternatively, you end up just signing the contracts without giving them a proper review. And you might think that that is actually what legal teams are there to do. They're there to review contracts. But the problem, as you'll probably all have experienced, that in these fast growth organizations, the pace of business growth just really fast outstrips the legal team growth. So your team stays the same whilst the business is growing and growing. And as the business begins to grow, the volume of contracts that they are taking in just massively increases. And as a result, more and more of your legal team's resources just being drained by these contracts, the more you do them in-house. So on the flip side of that, as an alternative, you could just decide that you're not going to review them at all. But it kind of goes without saying that's problematic, because as a legal team, you're there to act as sort of custodians for the business and protect them from risk. So if you're not reviewing all of your contracts, then you have no idea what the risk profile of your organization is. So that in itself is obviously a problem. So then there's also the question of actually how those contracts are being reviewed. So you're faced with this huge volume of contracts, but actually, how are you actually reviewing them? So there's always a consistency problem that is faced by these in-house teams. So you might, it's nice to have, if you like, to have a consistent contractual landscape, but really it's more than that. So if you don't have standard positions, you don't necessarily know where you've taken risks outside of those standard positions. And that's really not great when it comes to financing or insurance purposes. Both insurers and investors want to know where you've potentially agreed to something a bit funky that they ought to know about. So if you don't have consistency in your contractual landscape, you're not going to know where you have agreed outside of that scope. Knowledge capture is another problem with this huge volume of contracts. How are you capturing knowledge both outside of the legal team and within the legal team? So for example, you might instinctively know what your standard positions are for a particular contract, and somebody else in your team might have a different idea of what the company's standard positions are, and somebody more junior in the team might have absolutely no idea what your standard positions are. So how are you actually capturing that knowledge within the team so that everybody's reviewing things consistently? And finally, risk tracking. Are you in any way tracking the risks that you're agreeing to? So this is kind of the reverse point of the consistency point. Do you have any log of where you've agreed to something outside of your standard positions? Again, which is really important when it comes to financing or insurance. You want to be able to point to this log and say, well, actually, all of our contracts should look like this, but there's 5 or 6 that look like this instead. Okay, so where do you begin? These are obviously 2 massive problems, and it's really, really tempting to just jump into solutionizing this. But before we do that, we need to talk about strategy. So lawyers don't often have the luxury of taking a step back and looking at what it is that they're doing, what are our objectives for this year, what are we trying to achieve, and how are we going to achieve that by putting a plan in place. Lawyers obviously have very little time to be doing any of that, but it's really crucially important that you do, because if you don't have a plan in place or clear objectives and how you're going to achieve them, then ultimately you're always going to be on the back foot and you're going to be a reactive legal function rather than a proactive one. So just as an example, if you know, for instance, that your company this year is going to go for its Series C or whatever, you might start thinking, well, actually, at some point, somebody's going to come knocking and ask me for a data room. So you might start early doors, training your paralegals to look out for certain things, or start compiling the data room. You might look at engaging external counsel to support with that effort, so that you're not sort of thrown completely out of whack when somebody later down the line says, oh, we need a data room tomorrow, and you haven't even, it's not even on your radar. So it's really important that you think about your strategy when it comes to everything, but contracts in particular. We're going to go into the ins and outs of legal strategy in a later session, and particularly how to build your target operating model. And we've actually just released a blog post on it if you want to have a read. But for the purposes of this session, we're focusing on your strategy as it comes to contract management. So what is strategy? So strategy is simply resource allocation. So it means making clear-cut choices about how to compete. You cannot be everything to everybody. This is a quote from Jack Welch, who's the former CEO of General Electric, which apparently is one of the most operationally efficient companies in the world. So it's simply resource allocation. So the thing is that legal occupies a really unique position within the business. And I think it's really only rivaled by finance, in that you have access to every single team and you have touch points with every single team. And as a result of that, you can add real value across the business end to end. But at the same time, that really means that you're often pulled in every which direction because you've just got so many touch points. But as it says here, you can't be everything to everybody. And the more that you try and be everything to everybody will make you more and more ineffective, because you'll just get stuck doing low-level work and you won't be focusing on that work that really, really drives growth. So strategy, put simply, is basically deciding, it's as important to decide what you're not going to be doing as it is to decide what it is that you are doing. So that's where this distinction between core and non-core activities becomes really, really helpful. So your core activities are your defining strategic activities for your organization. If they're done badly, they'll put your organization at a competitive disadvantage. So an example of that might be a really strategic partnership that you're negotiating. If you send that completely externally, that's going to be problematic, because if it goes wrong, that could be quite catastrophic for your organization. You really need to have your arms around those real strategic partnerships. Conversely, you've got non-core activities. So these are non-strategic activities that you shouldn't be doing at all, ideally. These activities won't provide your company with a competitive edge, and they'll slow you down in achieving your objective. So that's not to say that these types of activities aren't important. They are, but it means that the more that your legal team's resources drained doing them, the less likely that you're going to be able to devote to those real strategic activities that drive growth. So examples of these are these sort of low-level contracts, NDAs, those sorts of things. The more you get bogged down in that, it makes it more difficult to focus on core activities. So how do you determine what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing? So you need to ask yourself a series of questions. And again, this is just a case of taking a step back and like really thinking and looking at your legal team sort of from an outsider's point of view. So from first question you need to be asking yourself is, what is my team's purpose? What are we actually here to do, and what are we trying to achieve? Then you want to look at what your team actually does, and is that aligned with your purpose, or are you doing stuff that you think you shouldn't be doing? So then what should your team be doing? What should our team not be doing? And what could potentially sit elsewhere? And I mean that sort of both within the organization and also outside of it. So when it comes to contracts, we can use this matrix to help decide where things ought to go. So on the right-hand side, you've got more of your core activities, and on the left-hand side, you've got your non-core activities. So if we start in the right, top right-hand corner, for high volume, high risk, value, complexity contracts. So for these types of contracts, you want to build competency within your own team, or presumably you already have it, but these are the sorts of contracts that you want to be doing in-house. And the reason for that is because, so for example, that might be a strategic partnership like we talked about earlier. The reason for that is because your team's knowledge of both the institution and access to people within the business is unrivaled by anybody else. So there's no value in using an expensive law firm to help you with those sorts of contracts, because your team knows more than everybody else and has better access to everybody. And those are the contracts that you really want to get your arms fully around, because they are the strategic contracts that are driving your business's growth. So it's the place where you can add the most value. So if you don't already have it, which you no doubt do, but you want to build your competency within your own team for those. Then on the left, on the right, bottom right, we've got low volume, high risk complexity contracts. So examples of these are perhaps a contract that's got a really complex financial regulatory element to it, or maybe you've got a framework contract that you need to be looked over by a payment services lawyer, or potentially a complex employment agreement, and there might be some elements of it that might end up going to dispute. So these are the sorts of things that you want to use a law firm for. So because they have really specific and specialist knowledge in that area that you don't have in your team, and it doesn't make sense for you to build the upskill and build the competency within your own team. And second of all, slightly more cynically, I suppose, you might want to rely on their insurance policy at some point. They are providing advice that comes with insurance. So for those sorts of contracts, it really makes sense to use a specialist law firm. And then on the left-hand side, we've got more of the non-core contracts. Now, people would often say or think that potentially non-core contracts aren't as important, but that's really not necessarily the case. BAU contracts keep your company ticking over, importantly. And also, I mean, this is where value thresholds that people often set below which they won't review contracts fall down. Because if you look at high volume, low risk complexity contracts, you might have a free trial agreement, and we see this a lot. You might have a contract that's a free trial, so the company just signs it, but actually as part of that free trial, you're giving over loads and loads of personal data. You might have some really sketchy indemnities in there, and because nobody's looked at it, even on a red flag review basis, that's just going straight through, and you're really exposing the company to risk. So for high volume, low risk contracts, you've got two options really. One, you can either outsource them to a law company, so distinct from a law firm, a law company or alternative legal services provider type organization, or you can hire somebody in-house to do that. You can just hire a dedicated resource who just does low-level agreements. The problem with hiring somebody in-house, potentially, is that you want to use your resources in a really smart way and use them strategically. So you'll probably find that, yes, okay, they're doing some low-level contracts at the outset, but you might start dragging them into the more strategic work because you're more resource strapped on that side of the business, and that's where you're really looking to drive the growth. So the more you sort of pull them away from the low-level contracts, the more that legal becomes a bottleneck. And the number one complaint that we hear about legal teams is that they're just too slow. So actually outsourcing to a law company that specializes in this area, or whatever area it is that you're outsourcing in respect of, becomes really cost effective. And finally, if you've got low volume but low risk complexity value contracts, you can insource those to the business. And we'll come on to insourcing in more detail in a bit, but insourcing is effectively like outsourcing, but it's just a case of training up an internal team and making them accountable for the delivery of something. So it might be NDAs that the sales team start managing. Right, so what next? So once you've evaluated what it is that your team is doing, you've looked at all the contracts that you deal with, and you've decided what is core and what's non-core, what happens next? Okay, number one, you need to put a plan in place. You need to make a decision as to what you're going to retain in-house, and if you do need to build any further competency there, what you're going to outsource, what you're going to insource, and map it all out, first of all. Once you've done that, I mean, it's all very well and good saying, right, I'm going to hand this off to the customer experience team now. But before you're able to do any of that, you need to get buy-in. You can't just hand it off. They might be like, actually, no, I don't fancy that at all. So you either need to get buy-in at a team level, or potentially you may even need to go to C-suite to get buy-in for your plan. And that includes any plan to outsource work, and you need to build your business case for that. And finally, budget. So for example, if you are looking at outsourcing, you might have had budget for a FTE. You might want to reallocate that and just juggle that around. Okay, so say you've decided to insource some of your work. So a few examples of some really easy things to insource. So one is data subjects access / rights requests. We often see that as a legacy issue, you sometimes get that legal is responsible for responding to DSARs because potentially there wasn't a compliance team early on, or you didn't have a fully fledged customer experience team. So legal ends up managing them, but they're not difficult, and it's not necessarily something that legal needs to be doing day in, day out, except for the more complex ones. So you can train up your customer experience team to deal with these, to recognize them and give them some canned responses, sort of template responses in response to each different request, and they can just get on with it. And the key to a successful insourcing relationship is accountability. When you do hand something off to another team, you need to make it crystal clear that they are accountable for delivering that, because otherwise you're in for a world of pain where you're getting questions every single day. What you want is a clear accountability framework where there are escalation points to you and your team, in the same way there might be an escalation point to finance, but you're not in any way accountable for delivery of that thing. Something else you can insource, we talked about earlier, is NDAs. So you just need to train up. You can redo your NDA template so it's super clear and there'll be minimal negotiation, and then you can train up the sales team to deal with NDAs, because it's just something that legal doesn't necessarily need to do, and they're super low risk, very, very rarely litigated. Something else that we've introduced for a number of people that we work with is a negotiation process. So you often find in these really massive negotiations that legal ends up serving as the project manager for them, and that just doesn't work, because legal shouldn't be doing project management. They're a really expensive resource, and B, legal doesn't necessarily have the right amount of clout within the business to get these things done, whereas a deal owner, a commercial person within the business, does. So we made a deal owner accountable for delivery of a negotiation, and it just works much better. They compile a deal team and get all the information that they need from them. So the benefits of that are the deal owner is the point of contact, not legal. Risks are managed better because the deal team understands it, rather than legal just saying, oh, there's this bit about some SLAs, can you just review this tiny bit? The deal team's much more engaged because there's a whole process around it and they understand what's going on. There's less work for legal. That's obviously a massive plus. And we found that this has reduced the time spent negotiating by 30% because people are much more engaged with the process. The deal owner has a massive impetus to get the deal closed. And ultimately that transforms legal into a competitive advantage, because if you can close deals quicker, then that deal owner can go out there and make more deals. It sounds like deals, but this is a really great example of where legal can add real value and make a real difference. So what about outsourcing? We've spoken a little bit about outsourcing, but outsourcing also has a number of benefits. I mean, there are two options. You can, as we talked about, you can either hire somebody to do these sorts of things, or you can push it elsewhere. So the benefits of outsourcing over just an individual or a team of individuals is that your work is typically managed by a team rather than just one person. So if it is the case that you are outsourcing your commercial contract review, you've got a whole team of people who are going to pick it up, rather than just one person who's got this huge backlog that's just growing and growing every day. And on top of that, the people that you're outsourcing to are typically subject matter experts. So you might have outsourced all of your IP to an IP specialist firm. Alternatively, if you're outsourcing your commercial contracts to a company, they might just be subject matter experts in commercial contracts, and they might have seen the same sort of counterparties and the same sort of agreements time and time again. So there's no need to upskill, which might be the case for a junior resource. Third benefit are outsourced services providers are accountable as suppliers, which is really important. So if you have got an outsourced service supplier, their payment is essentially contingent on them doing a good job. Whereas if you've just got a fixed term employee, they're going to get paid regardless. So there's a real incentive to do an amazing job. Whereas I'm not saying that people you hire in-house won't want to do a good job, but it's slightly different motivations. Outsourced services providers can provide really valuable data insights. So an example of something that we'll do, if we're seeing that we're getting a bunch of NDAs to review, we might suggest that we'll revamp your NDA process and documents so that we're not having to negotiate them all the time. They could also indicate where most of your legal requests are coming from. So actually we've seen 50% of the requests for legal support come from marketing. You might want to train up your marketing team so that they can knock out some of these things before they even need to hit legal. And finally, you can get back to your core strategic work and work to achieve your objectives without worrying that risks aren't being properly managed on the low level stuff. So just to provide an example for outsourcing, we provide outsourced contract review services for a number of clients. And as a result, we've developed a really, really clear methodology for how we do that. And this is our internal guidance note. So we work with clients to produce really robust playbooks for commercial contracts and NDAs and DPAs. We've got a team of people who have reviewed these contracts day in, day out. And as we work with lots of tech scale-ups, a lot of the counterparties are the same. So we kind of know what the contracts are. So there's no requirement to upskill. So when you do use outsourced service providers, they're really good at that one thing. Whereas if you have an in-house resource, you might want to be using them for other work. Okay, so once you've decided what's core, what's non-core, whether you're going to insource, outsource, and keep internally, in order to make a success of it, you need to make sure that you have the right tools in place to make sure that this stuff is properly managed. So crucially here, we're talking about playbooks, because as you start to insource and outsource and your own team is doing its own thing, you don't want everyone to just be agreeing to random positions all over the place. You really need to ensure that you have standard positions. And again, it's not just because consistency is a nice to have. It's really important because the positions that you take within agreements are commercial positions. They are business positions. If you've got everyone agreeing to different things, legal is taking on all of the risk of taking these commercial positions. What you really need is standard positions that have been agreed by your CFO, CEO, so that you can't have anybody come back to you and say, well, why on earth have we agreed to this? So on to playbooks. Right, what are playbooks? So I'm sure everyone knows this, but it's quite a broad definition. So playbooks are basically internal guidance or know-how documents which standardize a business's processes. They're not exclusive to legal. They can be used by lots of different teams, and they might take a different format depending on the team that's using it. So it might just be a simple checklist if you are asking your sales team to agree, what not to do with respect to a certain agreement. So why playbooks? I mean, these are pretty obvious benefits, but number one, it creates consistency across your landscape. We spoke about that earlier, but that has numerous benefits, not least for investment and insurance purposes. Playbooks also take the emotion out of negotiating. So if you're negotiating a contract on a Friday, you might be like, oh, whatever, you can just have that indemnity because I can't be bothered. But on Monday, you might be like, there's absolutely no way they're having that. So with a playbook, you can just remove the emotion completely, and as it's written right there. You reduce the time spent negotiating contracts because you have your standard positions. You're not having to go around the business to find out if everybody agrees. You avoid siloed team knowledge and a lifesaver for two members. They're new team members. They're basically the same point, but you avoid that sort of, oh, I know what our positions are, and this person thinks they know what these positions are. As soon as a new team member comes on board, you just can give them the playbook and they can hit the ground running. It improves your risk management. So if you know what your standard positions are, you'll also know where you've deviated from them. So you can create an exception or deviations log. So you know exactly what the risk profile of your organization is, rather than you just having a bunch of contracts all over the place without anybody having a clue what's actually in them. It's a no-brainer. Okay, so what should they look like? So as I mentioned, this is really varied depending on who it is that's using them. But if it's for your team, your internal legal team, then it's most likely going to be really super detailed. And it will probably cover most, if not all, of the clauses that you come up against, because particularly for junior members of the team, it's just way easier to just have everything in there and they can just work off that. It will include potentially explanations of what the clause is. Again, for the benefit of junior members of the team, this is what the purpose of this clause is. Your fallback. So your fallback position, you'll have your standard position, and then you'll have maybe one or two positions that you are willing to accept after that standard position, which are your fallbacks. You may have examples of markup. You may have a clause and then you've actually marked it up so people can visualize what that should look like. And then canned responses, canned or template responses. So these will be responses that you add in comments to the other side. And we found that this just really reduces the negotiations, because often when you're negotiating contracts and people just delete a whole clause without explaining why they've done it, it just creates confusion and more conflict. Then you've got playbooks that can be used by your internal team. So these could be, as I said, just a really, really simple checklist. So it might just be the key areas to look out for, the absolute no-goes, no, you absolutely can't agree to these things. You'll want to set out the rationale for why you are taking that position, so that they can be actually engaged with the process rather than them just ticking boxes. You want people to understand actually what they're doing. You'll then include an escalation matrix, so they know at what point they can escalate to you. And it might be that, you know, after fallback 2, potentially, if you have got fallbacks in this one, they then escalate to legal. And then training is obviously crucial. You want people to be engaged with the playbook, and you need to make sure that they understand it. And then you'll have external supplier playbooks. So these will be really similar to your internal team playbooks, most likely, but they'll also include that escalation matrix, because it might come to a point where your external supplier shouldn't be taking certain positions, and you want them to escalate to you so that you can take a view. Okay, so this is just an example of one of our internal playbooks, which is incredibly detailed, as you can see. So it kind of covers some of the things that I mentioned just on the previous slide. So we've got the type of clause on the far left-hand side, and then the issue related to that clause. We've then got an explainer. So this is what this clause does. This is what recitals are for. Then got an example of what the supplier might want and the customer. A marked up example where the supplier is marking up the customer's clause. Your canned response, and then whether or not the clause is negotiable, and then your fallback position. Okay, so how do you go about creating a playbook? So to do this, you need 2 key things. Number 1 is you need to know what your standard positions are. And number 2, you need to understand where you can deviate from those standard positions. So again, I would not suggest doing this on instinct. It can't be achieved in a vacuum. To find out what your standard positions are, you might have an inkling, but it's really important that you go around the business and you gather feedback. So for example, you might have always historically accepted 30-day payment terms because you've assumed that that's what finance want. But actually, your company might be growing and developing, and your finance team might actually want 45-day payment terms. And that's just a minor example, but it's those sorts of things. You might speak to engineering, and they might have funny things about transaction timeouts or something that needs to be included. And you can get really, really granular and really detailed. It depends what you want for your organization. But the moral is you need to go out and you need to get feedback from people. You also need these to be signed off, which I mentioned earlier. You don't want legal bearing the risk of taking various positions. You need to make sure that the CEO, CFO is comfortable with all of their commercial positions at the end of the day. So they need to sign off on them. You don't want to be out there taking risks that haven't been approved by the most senior people in the business. If you're producing an insourcing playbook, does the internal team, does your internal team understand it? It's all very well and good creating this really nice detailed playbook and then just handing it off to somebody internally and then being like, what the hell is this? We don't understand. So not only training, but, testing it. Do they get it? And I mean, maybe even watch them use it, sort of stand over them and see how they're using it to see if it's working. And just to build on that, it is an iterative process. So we at the Law Boutique talk a lot about legal design, and legal design is basically just putting yourself in the shoes of the user and developing solutions that solve that specific user's problem. So it might be that you don't necessarily get it right the first time, and you need to build and test and iterate on it. And what's also important is that you might find that as you're using your internal legal playbook, you might find that you keep agreeing to this other position that is your non-standard position. And at that point, you might decide, well, actually, the standard position that I initially had isn't that standard position anymore, and it should be this thing that we keep agreeing to. So it's a really good way of tracking that sort of progress. And then once you've done all those things, identified your core and non-core activities, decided what needs to go where, and then developed some really robust playbooks for people in your team or externally, you'll be well on your way to becoming a fully optimized legal function. Right, thank you very much. So any questions? Okay, I've got one. Stop sharing. Okay, so how do you best avoid producing a large number of deviations to your playbook? Does your playbook need to have been through a level of testing before it's implemented? Yes, I would definitely recommend that it does go through a level of testing before it's implemented. How long that period should be really depends on your organization. But it's a really good question. I think it's, first of all, you need to gather as much feedback as you can from within your team as well as outside of your team, so that you know that people can flag if actually the standard position that you've written there isn't normally the standard position. There are lots of deviations, but it is just a case of getting out there and testing it and seeing how you get on. If you are having a large number of deviations, then yeah, as you say, the playbook probably isn't right from the beginning. So definitely worth testing it beforehand. Okay, another question. How time consuming is it to build your own playbook? Not really. I mean, if you've got a very specific set of terms, then it's potentially more time consuming, because you're going to have to be really specific about the responses that you need for each and get those signed off. But if it's just sort of generic, you can whack something together in a few days based on what you know to be your positions, for example, for liability, your payment terms, what you're willing to accept for indemnities, IP, are you happy for them to use your logo without consent? Those sorts of things. For the low-level commercial contracts, it's fairly straightforward, and then you can just go around and seek feedback on it. What's the MVP for a playbook? Yes, good question. I think you can just build it iteratively. If you find that there are really key points that are really core for your organization, I mean, for every organization, you're going to be looking at liability, what your indemnity positions are, those sorts of big ticket items that your investors and people in the business are really going to care about. Start off with those things, and then as you're going along, just build it iteratively. And in terms of an MVP for a playbook, Google Sheets, Excel spreadsheet is just a great way to start. And it's just, everyone always goes back to Excel because it's really configurable. So I'd recommend that as your starting point. Okay. Have you seen good engagement from the business with preparing and rolling out playbooks, i.e. do they see the longer term advantage? Yes, definitely. It kind of depends on who you speak to, but I think there's a bit of an education piece that needs to go into it. I mean, you can sell playbooks quite easily based on the fact that they're going to speed up your negotiations, and they're going to protect the business from risk. So yes, I would say that you do see good engagement with the business. It's just a case of speaking to them a lot about what the benefits are. Legal is going to be much quicker. Legal can be leaner. I can reduce my headcount. And ultimately, we're taking the positions that you want us to, rather than just legal doing its own thing in a silo. Who in the business do you recommend carries out the playbook assessment, given the time constraints of in-house counsel? Could a paralegal do this? Yes, definitely a paralegal could do this. It might be that the paralegal just spends 20 minutes, half an hour with each person in your team and then goes out externally. But yeah, definitely, it's a fairly straightforward exercise. They can just speak to each of you and take down your typical positions, and maybe then just cross-check against other people in the team to make sure that you're all consistent, and then they can take it out to the rest of the business. So yeah, there's no reason why a paralegal can't do this, provided that they understand your terms and the general positions. Would you recommend any changes to this strategy where you're a sole legal counsel, or have noticed any specific recurring issues or challenges? I don't know if you mean just in relation to creating playbooks. I guess if you're sole legal counsel, you could, it's actually good to start building your playbook now, so for when you do bring on extra people. So as you're sort of typically, I mean, obviously it seems potentially a bit of a, you might think, well, my time is probably better spent elsewhere, rather than just adding all this stuff to a spreadsheet, when actually I need to be out there reviewing contracts. But it's probably a good idea to start putting one together at this stage, so that when new members of the team join, you can just hand it off to them, just simply putting together an Excel spreadsheet. Yes, that would be my recommendation on that. Would you say Excel is the best tool for a playbook? Again, it really depends on who it is who's using it. But for your legal team, definitely, because you might want it to be quite complex, and so it will have lots of fields, and it's just easier to change, and it's much more searchable. But if, say, you're creating something for an internal team, like a checklist, then something Words or even PDFs, so they're not going to change it, is possibly better. Or I mean, even slides, if it is just a simple checklist, you want it to be as engaging as possible. Okay. We've been discussing building a playbook for our own team, but lack of time keeps blocking us. Yeah, if we engage TLB to assist with creating one, assuming we engage with you in iterative ways you described, how time consuming would you expect the process to be? Not very, particularly from our perspective. We have already sort of standard positions that we suggest, or market positions that we suggest that people take in relation to their standard contracts. So what we do is we work with clients to literally takes a couple of hours to work with them to see if there's anything they want to add, or if they want to deviate from the standard positions that we propose, which are typically market, because your organization might have certain nuances. So no, it doesn't take that long. Any hot tips for creating an NDA playbook that can easily be used by the business to take those agreements off in-house counsel's plate? Yes, I think the key to implementing implementing an NDA playbook can be really straightforward. And again, it can just be like an Excel spreadsheet, but the key is accountability and training. You want to make sure that your team is really trained up on what the purpose of an NDA is and explaining to them what each clause means, because that's going to be super helpful so that they can actually take a bit of initiative and then have that point at which they need to escalate to you. Do outsource contract review suppliers like TLB also build playbooks? And would you say it makes sense to outsource the playbook build on the basis that the supplier has broader experience of what market standard is? Yes, I mean, whichever works best for you. I mean, obviously we do have a good idea of what market standard is, but presumably you do in your industry as well. So you don't necessarily have to outsource the build, but it potentially is more cost effective or time efficient if you're completely slammed. But I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, particularly if you know your contracts really well. So that's completely up to you. Sorry, I'm absolutely rattling through these. How would you tackle developing a playbook where working in multiple jurisdictions? That is a really good question. I guess it depends on which jurisdictions that you're working in. So for example, I know that we review a bunch of like US contracts, as well as UK contracts, and the same with European contracts, because ultimately the risk position is essentially the same, albeit the governing law might be slightly different, but the commercial position is the same. And from the business's perspective, they don't really care what jurisdiction that's in. But there might be certain nuances associated with multiple jurisdictions that you might need to take account of. I can't think of specific ones on the top of my head, but say there are specific regulatory issues or there's a certain clause that's associated with one jurisdiction, you might just need to include those bits. But generally speaking, the risk positions will be the same regardless of what jurisdiction you're dealing with. Yes, please can you help me understand a bit more about how a deal team person works, and do they also work to a playbook? Yeah, absolutely. So we talked earlier a bit about the negotiation process that we introduced, and basically what we did is we provided a deal team tool, which is again just a spreadsheet and a couple of spreadsheets that has each of the different teams within it, and legal wrote down every single question they would need from that team. So for example, from product, what is this about? What's the purpose of the contract? Speak to the commercial person in questions about what the commercials are. In the finance section, what payment terms are you happy to agree to? All those sorts of questions. And InfoSec has signed off on all this sort of stuff. So you have all that in there, gather all the information that you need. And we also had a similar exercise for the supplier, a supplier document that went to the supplier that had all of our questions in. And as part of the negotiation process, the way that it worked was by compiling a deal team, and then we trained them on how the negotiation would run and all of the different tools that are involved with it. And at that point, you hand off to the deal owner to own the process end to end. And it's just way quicker, and it means that legal is like completely hands off in those processes, which is great, because legal, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, they often end up being project managers, but that's not necessarily where their time is best spent. When they're really expensive, they should be driving the strategy. Okay, cool. Oh, another question. Oh, no. No, wait, there is. When you mentioned canned responses, is that effectively a copy and paste of what you would put in a comment bubble if the position in the agreement you're reviewing is not aligned to your standard position? Exactly, yes. So yeah, it's exactly that. So we can't accept this because of X, Y, and Z. And then you might have multiple canned responses for different fallbacks. So the playbook can get really complex depending on how sophisticated you want to get with it. Great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. And thank you so much for all your questions. That was brilliant. Our next webinar is all about reputation and personal brands. So we'll share the sign up link for that one as well in case you want to attend. We'd love to hear what you thought as well. So any feedback after this session would be great. So thank you all again for attending, and see you all soon.